I serve on the CCNI board and am the director of credentialing. Been in that place about a year. And it's my happy privilege to introduce Dr. Michael Marx as our presenter today. Michael is the past president of CCNI. He holds an Ed.D. degree, an MBA, and the PCC credential from the International Coach Federation. He also leads the ICF Global Ethics Community of Practice and sits on the Internal Review Board. That's the team that reviews coaches who've been charged with an ethical violation. Michael is the author of the book Ethics in Risk Management for Christian Coaches, and I think it's accurate to say that he is the world's foremost authority on ethics in coaching. Michael and his wife lived in Germany for many years. They now live in a small community north of Steamboat Springs, Colorado. They raise sled dogs, and he warned us that there may be a howling of the sled dogs when his wife goes out to feed them. And Michael leads sled dog tours for tourists during the winter. He's also an ambassador at Steamboat Springs Ski Resort. He is actively involved in his local church and in the community, and I consider it a privilege to call him my good friend. So Michael, welcome, and thank you for being our presenter today.
Right, thank you, Walt. And what you didn't mention was your daughter adopted one of our dogs.
That's right.
Indirectly, Walt and I are related. we're kin in that sense here. So yeah, it's absolutely a pleasure to be here. I would not say I am the foremost one, but I did write a book on Christian coaching ethics, that one. And so I wrote the book on Christian coaching ethics because it's the only one on the market. So the superlative is okay. And so far, I've got the only book, and I don't think too many people want to write books on Christian coaching ethics. So I'm going to start my slideshow. Walt, you've already gone off here, so let me just get this up on the screen and share. All right, hopefully everyone's seeing that. Walt, since your microphone ready, could you confirm that that's coming through? That screen?
Yes, it's coming through.
All right, great. So with the introduction that I've already had here, this is what we're going to be talking about today, is safeguarding your coaching from overstepping this sensitive line with too much direct communication. And in the IRB, the Independent Review Board that reviews the complaint cases, we have seen some of this here, but it's usually a follow function. In other words, you don't actually get complained about for this. It's usually like, I'm complaining about this, and they offended me. They overstepped the line. And so we'll talk about that, where you're overstepping that line. So, you've got the core competencies that tell you in the ICF sense how to coach, and then the code of ethics that say this is the ethical way of doing so. And until now, they've been two very separate documents. And we're talking about integrating them just a little bit more, and we're going to discuss that because the way in which they get integrated with each other will affect the definition on how we view an ethical violation. So being direct without being directive, that's kind of the theme. So yeah, Walt already mentioned my dog sledding, and this is a picture of my backyard. That's literally what I'm looking at my living room window. These are the 6 puppies that we got in January, and a prayer request is that our new neighbor who just moved in recently is not very happy living next to a dog yard, so that's caused a little bit of tension. So you might pray for us about that. Okay, you hopefully are aware that the CCNI has a code of ethics, and one of the things, point number 5, And I just wanted to get this point, on the table quickly and get it behind us, because it's not really the theme, but it obviously takes a certain amount of concentration to understand that number 5 says, I will disclose in writing something to the following. Coaching is offered with the assumption that each person is in a relationship guided by their values. As a Christian coach, my values and beliefs are based on Judeo-Christian worldview. While I am transparent about my personal beliefs, I do not seek purposefully to impose my values, standards, or use the coaching relationship to evangelize. So, one of the things that we stand on in CC&I is that you will be a Christian coach, and that you will not hide that label Christian in your coaching. I, for one, do mostly Christian coaching to non-Christians. And if you look at my website, I'm not overtly Christian, but if you read into it, you see very much so. And when I talk to people, they're always very aware of my religious point of view, even though they might not hold that. So what we have here is a professional relationship for the most part, and some of you are using coaching more as a ministry tool, so the Christianity is already on the table. But for some of you, you might even be in a more teaching or minister or counselor role, and your purpose using coaching is not to evangelize. Yet I want to tell you that if the Holy Spirit is in the room and the event becomes where moving forward means that that person finds a close relationship with Christ, that's a good thing. That's what you should do. You have at least my permission to do that here. The point of number 5 is to make you aware that you're not using coaching as a evangelistic tool. It's not a proselyting tool, but if it pops up, then fine. So give you an example, had a client, a long time ago, and he's still a client, where it came out that, his spirituality was lacking. And basically we coached into the point where he says, I probably need to get a closer relationship with God. And in action planning, how are you going to do that? Well, I'm probably going to talk to somebody like you, who I trust, for that step. So, it's never happened. I've been coaching him for about 5 years since that conversation. I'm still waiting every time we get together for maybe today's when he's going to move to that point. But yeah, it's Jesus we're talking about here, that relationship with Jesus where we can't get to God unless we get there through Jesus. So he is the rock of offense, the scandalon, the stone that makes men stumble. And it's a big point here. So if we do nothing else in our coaching, we have to make people aware that the ultimate moving forward is to move forward to a deeper relationship with Christ. So with that said, let's take a look at the 3 points from the ICF current code of ethics, and it's being rewritten as we speak. I'm on the committee for that too, and if you have ideas on what would be a good addition to the code, please send those to me, because that's exactly where we're at right now, is collecting ideas on what needs to be revised. So what I want to do in the next couple of slides is contrast the code. We're going to contrast therapy and then go through the competencies and talk about where directness is good coaching, whereas directive is not good coaching. So this word direct is going to be popping up all over the place. Let's take a look at the code number 5. It says true and accurate. When we're coaching, we make verbal statements that are true and accurate here. We're not couching our verbiage in any way to hide what we're really thinking. We're coming out with that. We're being true and accurate as to what you offer as a coach and the ICF coaching profession. We're going to take just a look in a moment, a look at the difference between coaching and therapy, because we have to be true to this. Now, there was a lot of tension in the industry. I want to say, 10 years ago for sure, up until about 5 years ago, where the mental health industry was saying, oh, you new band of coaches here, you're playing doctor, and they were absolutely right. There was a lot of coaches that were using the label of coach to, be a therapist. And ICF intentionally put this in here to, make it clear that we are not, by that standard, not trying to pretend to be doctors. As a result, the mental health professions have backed off of that. They're actually quite comfortable with that point of the coaching industry right now. A lot of therapists are moving over to coaching because, as what I keep hearing, is it's more fun. But, that's a different point. The point here is, though, that we're accurate and true about that. Number 17, ethically speak what I know to be true to clients. So we're talking about speaking the truth. In Christianity, we always say, speak the truth in love. To clients and prospective members about the potential value of coaching, the process, and me as a coach. So you're representing yourself correctly. It's a direct form of communication. Number 20, and this is really one of the more sensitive ones that we'll be diving more into, is finding boundaries, knowing where those boundaries are. And this is usually the one that gets crossed, where somebody says something to another person that offends them, and that triggers a emotional response where the client loses so much trust in the coach that they don't want to talk to them anymore, and they want to bring them in front of the IRB. So we'll come back to that point in just a second here. But as I said, taking a look at what is coaching and what is therapy. And this ironically comes from the Tony Robbins organization, these two graphics. And I find that ironic because Tony Robbins as a coaching organization is probably the most directive form of coaching. And yet he still makes this distinction. You can see in the overlap area that there's trust and rapport and great communication skills. Whereas, in the coaching side of the circle here, the clients seek cooperation. The coaching is done in active listening, whereas in the therapy side, it's treating without cooperation. The treatment does not have to be done necessarily with the cooperation, and the therapist is representing themselves as a qualified therapist. And so just to give you this contrast, I think this statistic comes from 2016, 15,000 life coaches and 106,000 psychologists. So you see the need for mental health professionals far exceeds the need for coaches. And actually the growth curve of both is steeper for mental health professionals than for coaches. In other words, more people are becoming mental health professionals because the demand is there than life coaches. Now, this next chart I think is very interesting. I want to camp out on this a little bit. And before I do that, I want to read the definition of coaching from ICF. Coaching is a partnering with clients in a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires them to maximize their personal and professional potential. I think this definition is lousy. It doesn't say anything about how it's done. And if you've listened to any of my presentations over the last 5 years, you know that I'm very much interested in changing this definition. And I have irritated the staff and hierarchy of ICF about this for a good number of years, because partnering in a thought-provoking creative process that inspires them to maximize. It doesn't say anything about the how. Now, put that definition, however, onto this chart, and you can see why they are reluctant to change it. What do I want to change it to? Well, I like it to include the core competencies in some form or another. The skill of coaching should be brought into the definition, in my opinion. But, however, when you look at this chart, you see that managing and training and business coaching and life coaching, that's all about the client. That's kind of our side of the industry. And mentoring and counseling is kind of a indirect other side of the helps industry, as it's sometimes referred to. And there's a lot of overlap. In other words, in managing and in training and in business coaching, there's a lot of non-directive good coaching happening. That's when it's the client side, but it's usually one coach to many, whereas on the other side, the value depends on the coach and more one-to-one. So on the right side, it's more coach-centric, and on the left side, it's more client-centric. And what we find is that the need for coaching is expanded. In other words, this intimacy with coaching is expanded the more you go down the chart and go from an organizational perspective. The organization needs coaching. If I can, twist this a little bit here, if you were coaching to the entire organization, not to individuals, you would really be consulting, because you're working with a whole group, 10 or 20 or 100 people, and you're trying to manage them with a coach approach. Whereas when you go down, it becomes always more a life coaching issue. I agree with Patrick Williams when he says that all coaching ultimately becomes life coaching, because if you're working one-to-one, then you're going to come up with life coaching issues. So what we have here basically is the need for what is called the non-directive approach. So I want to camp out on this word direct for just a second here. Direct we know as being forthright, as being straightforward. I spent most of my coaching career in northern Germany, which are known for being direct. And besides that, I grew up in upstate New Jersey, which is also known for being very direct as a cultural, personal way of doing things. In northern Germany, if you're not blunt, you're not effective. So we expect this here. But in other places like where I studied in Louisiana and where I was a teenager in North Carolina, that bluntness is regarded as rude. So what we're talking about is direct communication in the sense of the freedom to, with a high trust level, speak into the coaching relationship honestly and forthrightly. And we'll look at this and just how that unpacks in just a moment. Directive is when I'm saying my way or the highway. My way is the best way. What I'm telling you, Mr. Client, is what you need to do. I'm giving a prescription. I'm giving a recipe. I'm saying, I'm pretty smart on this topic, and I think you need to do it this way to fix your whatever problem. That's being directive. All of what you're seeing right here, managing, training, mentoring, counseling, can also be done in a non-directive way, and we're going to look at that. So the whole conversation in the next 40 minutes or so is teetering on this balance between being direct in the sense of non-directive coaching. So one more word that I'll add to the mix is directional. A coach facilitates a monologue. Chris McCluskey, who's speaking tomorrow, the leader of PCCI, always says that coaching is a facilitated monologue. You are allowing the client to unpack themselves, but the facilitation is providing direction. So I'll go over some examples in the next couple of minutes on being directional in a non-directive way. And so if you're new to coaching, you're probably already confused. But we'll come hopefully a full circle around into a comprehensive idea as to how to be a coach in a non-directive way in all of these environments. And quite honestly, when I look at all of the potential of the coach approach being applied to all of our lives, not just managing and training and counseling, but also parenting and, certainly sports coaching, the non-directive approach is basically at the heart of who we are on our side of the industry. Now, certainly, when I say our side of the industry, that includes ICF and CCNI, which is aligned with the competencies. We add the Christian element to that, and Walt, as the director of credentialing, will be the first person to tell you when we, CCNI, credential somebody, we are looking for the God addition that I first mentioned, you know, that Christianity being brought into the conversation in a correct, non-proselytizing way, but still effective for the Holy Spirit. We're looking for the Holy Spirit to show up in CCNI. That's really at the core, the approach difference between ICF and CCNI in terms of how we credential people. Tomorrow, I'm just looking at the sheet here, Chad Hall on actually Saturday will at 12:30, who's the founder of Coach Approach Ministries, might also be adding a little bit more to that. So what happens when you engage in directive communication? I think this is interesting from a book by Lauren Buys. He says that only 10% of the people are likely to recall anything that was done in a directive way, whereas in a non-directive way, there's a much higher percentage of retention. Up to 95% can recall what has happened in a coaching relationship 3 months after, but only 10% can be told something and recall what that even was 3 months later. So interesting book here, Management by Coaching. And again, here too, we're not talking about life coaching. We're talking about managing your company using the coach approach. Kees de Vries was the head of the IRB that we've already referred to. He's a very good friend of mine, and he and I talk on a regular basis. And he said to me back in January, and Kees is Dutch. He said, if you're not coaching heavy enough to get brought in front of the IRB, perhaps you're not coaching at the MCC level. And when a Dutch person speaking English uses the word heavy, he's thinking more of the word schwer. In other words, heavy in the sense of, you know, hard and biting and not weight per se, but penetrating. If you're not coaching at a level that's penetrating to the soul, your client, perhaps you're not coaching at the MCC level. And that might mean risking getting to that line where you're almost ready to offend the client. So good coaching is directional. We help the client find direction. However, we take our client down. We don't take our client down a directive path, because if we are saying this is where you need to go, you might end up being in a different place. So we have this compass and we're pointing them in a direction. But if you've ever done field work with a compass, you often know that if that's the only thing you're depending on, you're very often going to be way off the mark unless you have other landmarks along the way. So people need direction in coaching, and we'll unpack that in just a moment here, but not necessarily being told what to do. In this slide, I think it's really interesting to look at how on one side of the spectrum we have coaching in a very directional way on the bottom of both charts, and on the top in a very non-directional way. So I think it's interesting to contrast both of these because the charts look very the same, but from the authors, they're saying there's a difference between when you're playing a supportive role. So if you're a life coach, a wellness coach, perhaps even a business coach, you're probably more in a supportive role. But what when you are in a leadership role? You're wanting to use the coach approach in your leadership style. You're managing a team. You're managing a church. You're a pastor, for example. And you're using the coach approach in a leadership role. So if you look, I won't go through all of these here, but you can see that in the supportive role, on the left side, the directional way is suggesting a goal on the bottom, or giving advice, whereas on the top, you're more silent. You're just listening and summarizing. Coaching can be done all across the spectrum. That's actually where this definition from ICF that I don't like very much comes from, because it has to allow for all of this to happen, because all of this is technically coaching. At the same point in time, when you are working with the coaching from a leadership perspective and you are providing direction, leadership for your company, you have on the bottom telling, giving advice, offering feedback, and again up on the top a more paraphrasing, summarizing. So I think it's interesting to contrast that coaching can be done from a supportive role, or it can be done from a leadership role, and it's still coaching. So this question has been, at me for years as the leader of the community of practice for ethics. And about 3 years ago, a friend of mine, Terry Belf, and I wrote an article, "Do You Give Advice?" And it is posted on the ICF website. And until they changed the website, you could just Google Michael Marx giving advice and you would find it. Since the new website is actually behind the member login, but you can still Google that and you'll find a reprint of that through the ACTO, which is the organization that oversees coaching training schools. And the editor said this has been their most read article, "Do You Give Advice?" Because most of us are in this tension. I want to be a good ICF competency-based coach, but yet I feel the need to do what's best for my client by giving advice. Well, there's a way to do that non-directively, which I won't go into, but if you do find that article, it's been a very popular one because not many people have examples of how to do that. And I'd be happy to talk to you individually about that, however. So let's talk about the part where you were offending somebody. You're pushy. Merriam-Webster's.
Michael?
Yeah.
This might be a good time for me to give the
it is.
first half of the code that you'll need to get credits for this. And it's the word the. T-H-E, the. And also, just a reminder that you can put your questions or comments into the chat. And Amanda Bailey asks, is there a difference in how we tell this to new coaches versus practice coaches? Is that something that you could want to respond to right now, Michael?
Yeah, that's an excellent question because, like I said, almost every new coach that I've ever talked to wrestles with this. So what would be a good way to make sure that they have a basis that's going to keep them aligned with the ICF competencies? And my response to that would basically be, if you own it, and when you're speaking as a coach and you feel you own the solution, your solution is better than anything that the client could come up with, you're on a bad way. My favorite way of explaining non-directive, being direct in a non-directive way, Amanda, is put it on the table and let it wiggle. You just put it there and say, client, this is what it is. You're not, as a coach, attached to it. You don't suggest it. You're not saying this is what you really need to do or you're stupid, because this is what most people hear all of their lives is do it my way or you're stupid. Here it is, and take it or leave it. What can you do with it? What can you pick up? How much can you own with it? Put it on the table and let it wiggle. So being pushy, as per Merriam-Webster, is an aggressive or to an objectionable degree. And, in northern Germany where I live, the word aggressive is really one of those very, very bad words. In the United States, sometimes we look at aggressive as being, we want aggressive salesmen. Well, okay, really, do we? But in the in a lot of cultures, the word aggressive means you're just too far, you're too hard, you're pointing your finger at somebody. And this is what the competencies of ICF are really trying to keep you away from, is making people feel that their solution is less than anything than the best one. They have to be able to come up with this. We assume that our clients are creative and responsible. Actually, the phrase is creative, responsible, and whole. And as a Christian coach, as CC and I, we kind of push back on that whole a little bit, because we recognize that there is sin, and that sin makes you unwhole in the ultimate scheme of things. And so therefore there might need to be something done about that. Yeah, Walt, I'm not seeing the questions coming in the way I've got things set up. So if there is one, just pop in at any time.
Will do.
And I put on here this little note that it's possibly a good idea to tell the client, I will probably offend you at some point in time. And most clients think, huh? Well, it's really the way you introduce yourself. I introduce myself as a very edgy coach, and one of my mentor coaches, Walt Hastings, says I'm probably not edgy enough. And I'm like, really? I thought I was probably going over the top, and he says I could probably go a little bit deeper. And so we're going to look at that just in a second here. We're going to go through the competencies and see where the competencies are pointing out that you can be edgy. And so, with my North German approach to things, and I know that I'm probably the only one in the room that comes from that background, I have this way of just saying, yeah, this is what it is, take it or leave it. On the table, let it wiggle. And I introduced this in my case by saying when I wanted to retool my website for the North American market, I wanted to call it Kick in the Ass Coaching, but my Christian website strategist said that was probably not a good idea, so I called it New Trails Coaching, Blazing New Trails Coaching. But the point is that I might actually be a little bit edgy at the times, and that's basically who I am. So if you want a comfortable, cushy, grandmother type of coach, I can give you a list of people that are very, very easy to talk to. It feels like when you're coaching with them, you're sitting on the couch with grandma, and you'll tell them everything because it's a highly trustful environment. So, now I found the chat. Okay. I was just seeing things pop up here. I'm just looking at the chat here quickly to see if there's something I can address. But I said I was the only German in the room, and apparently not. So welcome, Christina. Herzlich willkommen. So let's take a quick tour through the competencies of ICF to take a look at where directional coaching, in other words, being direct. I didn't say the word directive. I said being direct in a non-directive way, providing direction. Let's take a quick tour through the competencies. Advance slide, please. Yeah. So in competency number 1, we clearly communicate to the client the distinctions between coaching and consulting. We're being very clear. This is not non-directive. Well, coaching sometimes is this, and counseling and consulting. This is part of competency number 1, ethics point number 1. These are sub-points that you can find on the ICF website that explain how each one of them pans out. In this case, I'm highlighting the directional way. And how we do that is we provide respect, number 3, for the client's perceptions, learning styles. We don't disrespect just because they are Hindu, or just because they went to a Montessori school, or they, grew up in a culture which was very collaborative. a high context culture or a low context culture, which is maybe different than ours. We respect that client's learning style and personal being. We provide support. Now, let me just get this laser pointer here. Yeah, that looks better here. We provide support and champion new behaviors. So that support is also a directional way of pushing into the client's way without taking over, saying, I'm going to monitor. We do hold the client accountable, but that's in contrast with the client monitoring it by themselves, and we are supporting them from the outside. We ask permission to coach sensitive areas, new areas. Now, let's camp out on the word permission for just a second. I often hear coaches ask permission, would you mind if? And a classical example would be the coach says, closed question, would it be okay if we opened in prayer? Or could I open us up in prayer? It's a closed question. Now, if you're from a culture where when somebody asks permission, you almost always give it to them, It's only northern Germany and upstate New Jersey, where I'm from, where people would say, nah, I don't want to do that. And I've actually been on coaching calls where I've been the client, and this coach has said, would it be okay if we opened up in prayer? And I say in my way, yeah, actually not. I'd rather not spend the time doing that. Okay, great. Heavenly Father, and she goes right into it. I think, oh, okay. Minus points for active listening. So how do you ask permission in a non-directive way? Well, I could give you several different examples, but one of my students, after I had mentioned this, that, it's better to ask an open-ended question, he opened up a coaching session in class one day with the, we have many different options on how to begin our coaching session. One of them is to open up in prayer. What do you think about that? And it gives the client room to say, yeah, we could do that, or no, I'm not really in the mood to do that. We are putting something on the table, letting it wiggle, making sure that the client has full capacity to decide the direction where it should go. We're just offering different possibilities. Okay, coaching presence, number 4. The coach trusts his inner knowing, goes with the gut. That's part of bringing out what you know so it can be put on the table. That is direct communication. How you do that will determine whether you're being directive or non-directive. The coach is open to not knowing. The coach sees many ways to work with a client, not just the only way or the best way. Or, one of my mentor coaches challenged me a couple of months ago. She said, Michael, what's your favorite question? So I thought about it. And she said, okay, don't use it for the next 3 months. Because this was my, $1 million question. This was the pivotal question that I got so much traction with so many clients. So I was actually, she was right, throwing it on the table because I knew this was just a high dollar question. So I was becoming dependent on the tool and not open to exploring every time whether that tool was really the most appropriate thing to put on the table. Humor. I don't actually hear humor very often in coaching. I hear people laughing at each other, but it's usually a nervous laughing. So where I come from, in other words, northern Germany, this means sarcasm. And I'll give you an example of sarcasm that worked very effectively. I was coaching somebody in Germany on the phone, and she had been she was a pastor's wife, and she was not working, and then she was going back into the workforce. And her goal, her action plan was to call 3 pastors the next day and introduce her new service. She was going to kind of set up a counseling center for children. And so her goal for the next day, her action plan was to call 3 pastors and introduce that to them. And I asked her, so what are you going to do after lunch? And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, what are you going to do in the afternoon since you're going to call probably these 3 pastors by late morning? And she hung up and she said, I was really mad at you, Michael. And it took me a couple hours to figure out why I was so mad. And she said, I realized that I had gotten out of the work rhythm. For me, calling 3 pastors was an 8-hour task. And when you said that, I realized that Michael would probably call 3 pastors before breakfast. In other words, I needed to change my work rhythm. And basically, the coaching was over. Every reason why she, in the end, figured out she needed coaching was all summed up in the fact that she wasn't working hard enough. She was out of the rhythm of working 8 to 5 like everyone else who has an 8 to 5 job, and that's what she needed to hear. But it was the sarcasm, the humor, my attempt at it at least, that actually bridged that gap here. So we use this. I don't use, hopefully, my sarcasm in a judgmental way, but sometimes it comes across that way, and that's where you can cross this line and people can get offended. So we confidently shift perspectives and experiments with new possibilities for the client's own action. Again, here too, it's a direction that we're providing to the call. Number 5, we distinguish between words, tone of voice. That's, inserting your coaching ability in there and saying, when you say success, what do you mean? Because everyone's got a different definition of success. So the words or the body language. We bottom line this, active listening results in a good summary. I often find, especially new coaches, use summary as a worn out tool. It's like, I'm going to summarize everything because that's what I'm supposed to do. But that's not active listening. We use bottom lining summarization, which Jane Creswell calls synthesis, where we bring together all of the client's ideas to say in one way, this is a new way of looking at it, put it on the table, let it wiggle. Basically, the client says, oh, that's right. That's a new perspective. I'm gaining awareness with that. So obviously, direct communication is really big on this point. The coach is clear, articulate, and direct in sharing, providing feedback. This kind of is the epitome of what I'm trying to get at today. We are clear, articulate, and direct in sharing and providing feedback to our clients, but we can do that in a non-directive way. We reframe and articulate so that the client can understand from another perspective what we have said. Again, here too, we are respectful to the client. We are non-sexist. We don't use jargon. One of the ways Cheryl Scanlon always says this is use the vocabulary of the client. We use metaphor and analogy to illustrate a point or paint a verbal picture. This usually works very well, especially if the client uses a lot of metaphor. And if they think in pictures, it's a wonderful way to verbally paint a picture because the client thinks in pictures. So you're adapting to their style here, and you're providing them a direction, the facilitated monologue, to go where they need to go to explore. Creating awareness goes beyond what is said, goes to underlying concerns. What we do in coaching is create awareness. As one of my friends says, actually, she prefers to say we increase awareness, because it's not that we coaches are creating the awareness. The client is creating awareness, and our job from the coach's perspective is to increase the awareness. We help the client discover for themselves new perspectives here. This is providing direction for them, a broader perspective, insights into what the client's saying. We distinguish between trivial and significant issues. That deep dive. One thing that I find is the difference between ACC level and PCC and MCC level coaching is that ACCs tend to coach towards the wants, and PCCs and MCCs coach towards the needs. As Walt Hastings would say, coach the who and not the what. And that's a lesson in and of itself, so I won't unpack that too far. But let me give you an example. I was coaching somebody last week, and she leads a team of what was a year ago 20 people and is now 13 people. And she's 62 years old, and she was telling me how cohesive this whole team is. And I said, and there might be a problem. And she said, what do you mean? I said, you just dismissed 7 people from your team. You're 62 years old and you have no succession plan. And this was video conferencing, and she looked at me like a deer in the headlights, her mouth open. Like, oh my goodness, you're right. She had never thought of the fact that almost half the team was dismissed in the last year. Everything centers around her. And if she gets hit by a bus or if she decides to retire, everybody's out of work. Anyway, I'm putting it on the table, not really with judgment. I'm just saying, you run a business and this is missing. You don't have a succession plan. So we're creating awareness, or like I said, increasing awareness on things that the client is not aware of. So designing actions, directional, we're providing new learning, alternative ideas. We're doing this without attachment. As I said already here, you don't say what you want to say with any attachment. It's there. It's with an open hand. It's not a closed fist. You're just putting it there and saying to the client, consider this. What about this? Mm-hmm. We stretch the client here. That can be challenging. And I find, especially among Christian coaches, we're too nice. We're just too nice. We don't want to offend anybody. We don't want to be edgy. We don't want to be, pointy. We don't want to be jabby. We're just too nice. And, what I like to say is, if you want a nice conversation, have your friend take you to lunch and spend $26 or something like that. But if they're spending $260 for a coaching session here, it better be worth something. The coaching conversation is not a normal conversation. It is moving forward. It's directional. It's helping them doing that. But we do this in a non-directive way so that the client can understand that. We identify and access resources. I'm very often recommending a book. I hold up a book. This is one book that I recommend a lot by my friend Jeff Spedafora from Halftime Ministries, The Joy Model. I just say, hey, there's this book on the market. It does X, Y, and Z. You might take a look at it. And sometimes, I get good feedback. That was a great book. Thank you for recommending it. It's like, it didn't work for me. But again, the client owns that. Okay, and then summarizing here with managing progress, we clearly request, so we're giving direction to the client. We're holding attention to an action plan, and we're not going to forget it. We come back in the next call and saying, this is what you said you were going to do. What happened? And I had a mentor client yesterday. He said, how do I hold my client's feet to the fire? I said, they give you an action plan, and you ask them about that in the next one. You don't have to be the accountability partner for all of your clients, but it is good coaching to bring back whatever the client has said, and that is providing direction for them to move forward. We give them the ability to move to a big picture, self-discipline. We confront the client. These are all things that are edgy, that are direct. So what we have in the end is a premise that we don't want to hurt anyone, but at the same point in time, we do want to be a good steward of what the client has given us. I love the prime directive from Star Trek. No starship may interfere with the normal development of any alien life or society. In other words, we're going to help them, but we're not going to change their direction without them changing it for themselves. We're just there to help them move forward. But a lot of times what you'll find is you're thinking, oh my goodness, if I offended you, you should have really heard what I was thinking. Because when you find as a coach that what you're thinking is much more direct, this prescriptive method here. When you find yourself thinking that, you're probably exuding that in your coaching conversation one way or another. So here's where we're going to transition to that line where you could be drug in front of the IRB. Be careful of who you're dealing with. I don't remember the name of the guy that I got this from, but he has 23 laws, and law 19 is, know who you're dealing with. Don't offend the wrong person. And, being the North German that I am, I often have to catch myself saying, I'm in an environment where if I do it the way I feel like I would do it naturally, if I'm just being myself here, I actually might offend that person here. So that ability just to stand back and think before you speak. Now, the other slide I have on here is it's difficult to offend a New Yorker, because those of us from the New York metropolitan area, we also have this New York style way of just putting things on the table and thinking that that's cute, whereas the rest of the nation think it's just a little bit too edgy. It's just a little bit too direct. So the idea is know who you're talking about. But if you are working with New Yorkers, and like I said, the guy that I was talking to yesterday was actually in Manhattan, and he has this very directional approach. And he says, is that wrong? And it's like, what will happen is you will attract clients that have a similar mentality to yourself. So what we're concluding here is basically the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. I actually read a modern translation of the original Hippocratic Oath, and he actually never said that, which I thought was interesting. Do no harm. But the essence of what he was saying in the Hippocratic original document was do no harm. Two things: help people and do no harm. And I have this other slide on here that talks about, judging. To me, judging is when we say that the way they sin is inappropriate. The way I sin is appropriate. So I love the statement, don't judge someone just because they sin differently than you do. And one of the things I learned from, new coaches, one of the phrases she popped out in class one day was, I look at coaching as a no judgment zone. Oh, that's really good for me, because I can be very judgmental. And so for years, I had a sticky note on my monitor, my computer, coaching is a no judgment zone. And it really helped me just remind myself all the time that in the coaching relationship, in the conversation with clients, I'm not judging them. So just to come into a landing here, what would happen if you are complained about? You would be brought in front of the Independent Complaint Board. And I have here the statistics for 2015. You can see that 20 cases were received by the IRB, and only 7 cases were administered in 2015. In 2016, it was 1. In 2017, it was 8. Correct. In 2018 to date, it's been about 4 or 5. So there's not a lot of cases that we actually administer, but when they come in and we look at them, 50% of them are business disputes, and 25% are lack of clear agreements. So we're talking about the contract. So some of the things I said, you're clear on the contract, is absolutely essential. But some of these other things, the unclear definition of coaching and a misrepresentation around qualifications, conflict of interest, that remaining 25%, that's really where we're talking about today, where you're crossing the line. And just to introduce you to our team, the Independent Review Board, I'm the farthest one on the right. Great group of people, international all. U.S. citizens are in the vast minority on this team. Malaysia and Singapore and Argentina, as you can see, Turkey are represented here, because we're trying to look at everything from a very global perspective and not just have one cultural perspective. So if you have a problem, you can contact the Coach Federation. At the bottom here is the Ethics Assist line, ethics at Coach Federation, the telephone number. We have a hotline, as I like to call it, where you can contact my friends at ICF. And for example, most of the questions that they get, really about 95% are off the shelf. In other words, they get these questions all the time, and the staff have notes on, these are, standard best practices and how people handle. So that's what you'll get most of the time. But if you do get something that's really specific, like suicide, they might defer you to a specialist in that area. So often I get deferred contacts from ICF because, suicide is actually how to deal with suicide in the coaching relationship, how to do an intervention is one of my specialties. So we have the ethics community of practice. You could sign up for it. And we're going to, for example, on the 24th of October, have the next one where we'll be discussing the revisions to the code. And there are recordings of a lot of these ethical dilemmas that you've been wondering about. We probably have a recording for this, so you could contact me on that. And that's my contact information. New Trails Coaching, as Walt mentioned, I live in the mountains of Colorado. So if you'd like to come up here and go dog sledding and skiing, I'd be happy to help you with that. And so, Mr. Hastings, that's where I'm at.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Let's see. I'm going to click my video back on so people can see me. Time to give the second word of the passcode, and that is the word alpha. It's the first letter in the Greek alphabet. It's spelled A-L-P-H-A, alpha. So now it's time to look at some questions. If you have questions or comments, you can put them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. By the way, thank you, Michael, for keeping your presentation under an hour. So Christian has a question. When establishing the coaching relationship, do you state that you will likely offend them at some point? And do you ask them, how will I know if I've offended you?
Yeah, those are great questions. And I think it's also one of the ways you contract. Like I said, contract disputes are one of the more typical things we deal with in the complaint board because you're not clear on that. So, I talked to somebody yesterday. He said, my last coach had a very definite beginning and a very definite ending. And I said, that's nice. We'll just start and see where it goes. He said, oh, so you don't have a definite one? No. In other words, I was clear on the fact that it didn't have an ending. And the second part to your question was, run it by me again?
How will I know if I've offended you? Do you ask them that?
I don't. I probably should. That's really a nice question here. I think it's also part of the ability to read people and see their pushback. That's one of the reasons why I like to use video conferencing, because I can read the nonverbals. And if you're only in telephone, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And of course, in face-to-face, it's much more easier to read. So I guess in the phone environment, that would be a really good question to ask. How will I know that I will offend you? Because it is likely that I will do that. At the same point in time, I usually feel that if the trust level is high, they will tell me. So what we're trying to achieve in coaching is the highest level, quickly as possible, trust, so that the client is free to be very transparent in how what we say offends them.
I don't see any other questions. So if you have a question, quickly put it in the chat box and we'll deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not seeing any other questions come in, Michael.
Okay, good.
Let me just comment that each of you should receive an email with a link to a questionnaire asking you to evaluate this session, and that is where you will put in the passcode. So you have to evaluate the session to get your continuing ed credits. Pam is asking, I'm not getting the first word there. Mostly deal with problems about people getting offended in their coaching sessions. What are they hoping you will do about it?
Mm-hmm. What most people want, if they are bold enough to bring up the offense to you as the coach directly, saying, hey, what you said yesterday, kind of offended me, or that hurts my feelings, is an open dialogue. And I think the coaching conversation, kind of goes on hold until, that is dealt with. I had an interesting confrontation with a client the other day. He showed up and we had agreed to do a video conference, but he didn't want to turn his video camera on. He said that he was very self-conscious about seeing himself on a video camera. And I said, oh, okay. Well, I guess we could do it without it. And he said, basically, if you're wanting me to use the video on Zoom, then, we're going to have to talk about how this relationship moves forward. I'm like, well, okay. And this is somebody that I've been working with for a long time. And so I was kind of confused as to why he wanted to move to Zoom without the video. But nevertheless, we had rescheduled the conversation to talk just about that on Friday. So what they're hoping that you'll do about it is, respect their opinion, but also just not, cast it off and say, oh, well, you're just being silly. I hope that answers the question.
So Melody has put a note there to everyone about the receiving credits, filling out the survey. So be sure and read her note.
Right. And she also adds, if you're calling in by phone, you'll need to respond by email to director@christiancoaches.com. I'm just reading. Mm-hmm. Okay. I think we're good,
Well, Michael,
Kelly.
it seems like there are no other questions. Thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. And we sure appreciate the time and energy you spent in putting this together for us.
You're welcome. Always fun to give a presentation for CCNI. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we are wrapping it up now. Thank you, everyone, for being here.